advanced journal out of Great Britain, very prestigious journal, and then wrote a book called The Hunt for Zero Point, which I recommend, based on a lot of information that we had begun to put out, and particularly as it applies to propulsion. All right. So if you create this kind of vector into the zero-point energy field, and you create a certain counter-rotating vortex, let's call it, which is almost a Sufi-like phenomenon, you get what's called lift, and you get a phenomenon that's known as electromagnetogravitics. Now, the pop culture would call it anti-gravity, which is really not correct. What you're really doing when you see a UFO moving and it's going straight up 10,000 miles per hour against gravity is that it's actually in a space-time bubble. It's creating its own environment, shall we say. So there's no restrictions to normal aerodynamic formula. And so the thing can lift and go straight up at those velocities. And if it goes through another level, the entire object, the mass of the entire object, can become massless. And this has to do with things that are very technical that we'll get into a little bit later if you're interested in the technical part of this, which I think is fascinating. And that's when you enter into what's called the trans-dimensional physics, when something moves from one dimension to another, or transverses one dimension to another. By definition, all interstellar vehicles are trans-dimensional. Let me repeat that. If it's interstellar, it is trans-dimensional. It is not getting here at a subluminal or below the speed of light velocity. This is a key understanding because most people will say, well, maybe they're interdimensional or maybe they're interstellar. And I'm going, you don't understand the physics of this. If it's interstellar and it's here, meaning it somehow went from another star system to here, and someone's lifespan, a creature's lifespan, even if you live to be 800 years old, it's got to be faster than the speed of light. But the term faster than the speed of light is a misnomer because you're no longer bound by the physics of the speed of light or even the normal vacuum of space that we think of, because you've resonantly shifted into these, if you will, parallel universes or enfolded universes transdimensionally, and then you step back down into this one. Too much information? All right. So this is the key thing that people have to understand and began to be studied. Now, in the early days, let's go back to the time of Tesla. They were observing with usually DC power systems, direct current, as opposed to alternating current, which we use in our homes, which Nikola Tesla invented or came up with. That would have this effect where a certain amount of energy would go into a system, more would come out. It wasn't really accepted until Dr. Casimir, a physicist named Casimir, and the Casimir effect, where this was published in mainstream physics journals, by the way, proved that there was this zero-point energy field, that there was this energy that was left even after you cooled down all the atoms and all the activity in the universe down to absolute zero, which is a specific temperature. And there's still this energy there. And that zero-point energy field, as it turns out, is embedded everywhere in space, not outer space, here in this room. So that every cubic centimeter of space in this room, for example, has enough power to run at least the United States for a day, a cubic centimeter. So it's an enormous field of energy. So running our planet on this energy field would be like taking a thimble out of the Great Lakes or something of water. It's a trivia, it's a rounding error. However, as J.P. Morgan famously was reported to have said to Nikola Tesla, when he had a car that had a little antenna on it that was running around where the batteries were charging themselves, J.P. Morgan said, if we can't put a meter on it, we don't want it. Big bankers. Now, 100 years ago or 90 years ago to today, nothing's really changed in terms of the geopolitical, financial, macroeconomic exigencies. And that's the huge problem. Is there a technical challenge? Yes. And we'll get into how we can mount a sort of effort together to come up with a modern day version of what Tesla had. But the geopolitical macroeconomic policy issue is the big problem. And it isn't just because there are a few bankers and kleptocrats that are misanthropic sociopaths, although some of them are. It's because there are a lot of stakeholders who don't want to have to deal with the change. I remember my military advisor once meeting with an admiral who was in charge of CONUS, Continental United States Security, saying, well, this is all wonderful, and I know that those technologies do exist in classified programs. It's too big of a change for me to have to deal with. I just want to see that everything stays in sort of a homeostasis. We don't rock the boat too much, and I retire from this command and get to go fishing at my place in Montana. No, really. All right. So having had dozens and dozens of meetings personally with people like that in the national security structure in Washington, in the United Kingdom, from France, and elsewhere, there is this consistent refrain of, this is a great thing, but it's too big of a change. It's too big of a challenge. And therefore, if it's that big of a challenge, it's better just to kick the can down the road and let someone else deal with it later. So there's been 100 years of kicking the can down the road. Meanwhile, to give you a very big picture of how much trouble we have at this point, we have a geopolitical order where our vital national security interests, which is a mantra here in Washington, is an actual phrase for oil, protecting the oil interest. The madness going on in the Ukraine and Crimea right now is 100% or largely influenced by natural gas and oil politics. Certainly the Middle East, anyone knows that that is. People say, well, there's Israel there. I say, yes, but they have a couple hundred thermonuclear weapons and can take care of them. I know for a fact they do. So the big problem becomes if you have, let's say in 1927 or so, 1927, there were 2 billion people in the world. Now there's 7. So of those 2 billion people, there were very few people living with cars and electricity in their homes and et cetera and so on. Now you have 7 billion people and billions more people living on that system, which has become entrenched, bureaucratically built into our funding mechanisms from the state, local, federal level of support, and also where there are a lot of very powerful stakeholders. And so from a rational point of view, you'd say, well, these technologies would get us off of oil, gas, nuclear power, no more Fukushimas. But from the point of view of people who are looking at the national security equation from a macroeconomic stability point of view, this is their worst nightmare. Up the road here, between here and the White House, if you walk straight up the road here, you'll end up at the White House. It's at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and we're on 16th Street. I was at the University Club with a man who was sort of the consigliere for President Bush Jr., W, a few years ago. And we were having dinner, and this is a place, you know, you'd have Rumsfeld there and other people there, you know, in this place having dinner or lunch. It's a private club. I don't belong to it, but I was invited. Actually, I had to put on a jacket. I was shocked and appalled. Anyway, so I did. And you know, he said, look, you have to understand that everyone who gets into that house, pointing to the White House, governs as a conservative. From the point of view of the classic definition, don't change anything. Conserve. Don't change. Keep things as they are. Tradition. Because when you're dealing with a change this large, this is what the people call a disruptive technology, but writ large. And disruptive technology writ large in this, how I'm speaking of it, is something that would have a multi-$100 trillion impact. Not billion, trillion. So let me repeat that, multi-$100 trillion impact. Because once this is disclosed, and this backs into why, quote, UFOs are secret and forbidden to talk about in polite circles, is that a UFO is really just a misnomer for an alternative energy and propulsion device. All right? They are not moving using Exxon Jet A fuel. All right? They're not using a nuclear reactor on those little things. They're using this whole new area of physics, which is elegant, beautiful, life-sustaining for the planet. But if you said those were real, people would say, oh, how are they moving like that? Any physicist at MIT would ask this question if they thought it was real and hadn't been brainwashed by the psychological warfare disinformation campaign launched by the CIA in 1953. So that's the problem, is that if you begin to talk about the phenomena of new energy, free energy, anti-gravity, UFOs, you're stepping into an area that is the most sensitive, compartmented intelligence in the history of the United States. There was a time when I was willing to kind of play along with some of these inventors with their secret proclivities. That was a decade ago. At this point, the answer is no, no, yet, never, ain't gonna happen. And the reason is, if I know what the result is going to be at the end, you'd be insane to start it at the beginning. All right? So it isn't for nothing that since 1992 and 1993, I've been having meetings and doing briefings for the head of Army Intelligence and the CIA director and putting together presidential briefings and moving around with, getting Rockefeller to host the Clintons at the ranch to go through all this stuff with them. Some of this you know, some you don't. But you learn through those lessons. And what I have learned is where I started. Disclosure, complete openness about all these technologies. You cannot fix this problem from the consciousness that created it. And greed, avarice, secrecy, that's what's gotten us where we are. That is at the core of the massive oil, fossil fuel, national security superstate that we have built up around us. So if you use that same consciousness, you're not going to escape from that black hole. So we have to have a whole new consciousness that guides these endeavors, or we're going to repeat history over and over and over and over again. And that is the great tragedy of our time, is that because this subject is sort of the stepchild of science, and there has been a divide and conquer nature to all these inventors who, one will pop up in England, one will pop up like Stan Meyer in the Midwest, one will pop up in Australia, one will pop up in South America. And there are all these sort of lone wolves out there that are easy to pick off one at a time. So we have to come together as a people and do this very overtly, not secretively, with a proper public involvement, because the public wants this. 99.9% of the people on planet Earth would benefit from this. There is a very, it's not the 1%, it's the 0.0000001% who would not benefit from this because they are the ones sitting atop the petrodollar system, the macroeconomic order, and particularly the fact that it is run, and everything we're using is run on a metered, linear energy source, even solar and wind. The big $2 billion solar farm being done out in the desert of California. I mean, that's a huge thing, but it's all centralized with a centralized utility. What happens when you have something that would fit on this table and it will run your house? Pulling energy from the quantum vacuum or the zero-point energy field. You don't need utilities. How many people have stock portfolios with utilities in them? Bye-bye. You don't need ExxonMobil. You don't need BP. You do not need coal. So there goes all of Australia's coal exports to China. Unnecessary. Don't need it. On and on and on and on it goes. So there would be an impact But if we don't do it, the impact we're facing is 1,000 times worse, which is a geopolitical order where you're likely to see a war in the South China Sea over oil deposits, where we have this situation now in the Ukraine and Crimea and with Russian gas and Europe needing it, the Middle East conundrum, on it goes. So beneath that is a deeper crisis. True statistic, 48% of inhabitants of Earth do not have indoor plumbing. So the old saying, don't have a pot to pee in, literally 48% of the 7 billion people on Earth. So we have this growing disparity between the people who have things and those who do not. But that is what happens, and it gets very extreme before every massive global revolution or war, like in the 20s before the Third Reich rose. I think we have to begin to look at this and say, how can we stay on this path when the outcome is huge problems with the environment? Even if you don't believe in climate change as a result of fossil fuel, these other issues are going to catch us before that does. So long before we have a problem with the climate, which actually we're having a problem, the UN report that came out this week makes it quite clear. But even if you don't accept that in your paradigm, the inhumanity of keeping these sciences and technologies away from the public and the poverty that it engenders. Because I was talking to an industrialist from India, and he was telling me it would take trillions of dollars to properly electrify the subcontinent so that people have the energy they need using today's conventional systems, even solar, even wind, even coal. And you know, we're facing a situation now that every year or two there's 1,000 new coal-fired burning power plants being put online in India, China, and elsewhere, mostly without any scrubbers. So in the Pacific Northwest and other places, you have a huge amount of the pollution that's in the West Coast is coming from Asia because there's no scrubbers in those coal. And you look at the air in Beijing and Shanghai and other cities, it's not breathable. Then you go to the oceans, where you have the Fukushima reactor releasing all this radioactive material, and huge parts of the oceans, because there's all the CO2 going into the oceans, are beginning to die because of the acidity and alkaline levels being upset. So there are all these big macro geophysical effects while we're trying to maintain the current macroeconomic order. Big problem, huge mistake. But who's going to fix it? This is really the crux of the problem. Now, many people have asked me, given the folks I've met with over the years, why doesn't someone do that? But see, everyone says that. My wife and I this week were just up in New York meeting with the head of a foundation. And the question came up frequently with people there, all of whom were incredibly wealthy. Well, why doesn't Bill Gates do it? Or why doesn't the president? It's always, why doesn't someone else? Of course, if you go to the president, he'll say, no way, Jose. And if you go to billionaire X and billionaire Y and billionaire Z, many of whom I've met with, they'll go, you know, one of them once said to me, we all want to be first to be second. Great expression. You hear it a lot in business. When it's a very controversial science, no one wants to be the first to stick their neck out. So this becomes then a leadership issue, which is what I've tried to provide some clarity to in my own humble way, being not a significantly wealthy or powerful person at all, but knowing what I know, try to share it with the public and try to create a momentum towards disclosure, not only of the fact that we're not alone in the universe, but that the secret behind these UFO propulsion systems and energy systems would give us an entirely new planet. Beautiful. But there are stakeholders who are very, very powerful who aren't happy about that. Now, you know, at the World Economic Forum at Davos a couple of months ago, it came out that there's about 17, they said 35, but it's actually more like 32, and the Swiss Institute said more like 17 people and corporations that those people control that have about the equivalent of the net worth of the lowest 50% of the world's population, which is true. And some of these folks I have met with and briefed over the years, and in fact very recently. As some of you may have heard, I can't go into any details about it, I was asked to go to an island in the last few months with about 120 world leaders and people from Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group and various people. And I wasn't allowed to bring any assistance, or I could have brought my wife, but it was too, she didn't like traveling so much. And so I went by myself, and it was daunting. Not because of who was there, but what the task was. Because there were either people there who knew that this existed and were seething that I was on the agenda, or there were people who knew nothing about it and had no foundation for understanding it. And I had 45 minutes to discuss it. Now, you know, that's the nature of these kind of confabs, if you've ever been to any of those sort of things. But we made a lot of progress with that, because the head of this institute that hosts this event every year ended up asking us to take the Disclosure Project 2-hour DVD that has all, you know, dozens and dozens of these military witnesses, and also has the presidential briefing document, the early ones that we put together, in there, embedded in a PDF file, and sent it to the top 50 people who were there. So, and that was just recently, or 30 people. So we're continuing that educational process. But time and time and time again, whether in LA, I was giving a talk to a group, and there were about 110 people there, but 12 of them were billionaires. And every single one of them would say, well, I wouldn't want to do something like this, but so-and-so might. And it's kind of like the little red hen, you know? Everyone would like to see this happen, nobody wants to do it. And so that, you know, it's kind of comical, and I kind of feel like, you know, Lawrence Rockefeller, back in '93, turned to me, or '94, 20 years ago, and he says, don't leave your medical career, because really no one's going to take any risks with something this controversial. And you know, you'll just end up being the court jester for a lot of the public and a lot of the elites. Not court jester, but you know, information or infotainment, but no one's really kind of stick their neck out on this because this is too heavy a lift. And I was appalled at his cynicism. And 20 years later, I go, you know, old guy was right. It's sort of a sad view of that situation. But ultimately, I have to take the view that we as a people can still do this. I'm the eternal optimist. You have to be if you're an emergency doctor. You know, you're working everything to save that 3-year-old child. And believe you can, and you can't do sometimes, and sometimes you can't. But that's the mindset of an emergency physician. And I think that what we have to look at is what does it take to do something wonderful for our children and our children's children. And it can't be the consciousness of what's in it for me. And that's, of course, the whole concept of venture capital and most technological plays. For example, here's a mistake many people have made. They come up with one of these systems, maybe it's a prototype that's only putting out 100 watts of, quote, free energy that's coming from the vacuum, i.e. over what's going into it. So say, there's 10 watts going in and 100 watts coming out. I know many people, there's a man at Lawrence Berkeley Labs who had done this. And they get approached by someone who says, oh, well, work with me, and we're a VC group, and here's $50 million for a startup. Guess what? Those folks are either shilling, they're fronting for the intelligence community, or they're sincere, but then someone comes in later with $5 billion and buys them out. I met with such a man not long ago at my home in Virginia, out at our farm, and he says, oh yeah, well, $50 million wouldn't be a problem, but I would want to have control over the corporation and the technology. I said, I don't think that's really a good idea. Have you ever gone mano a mano with the national security state? He says, no, but I've done lots of, apps and, stuff. And, he thought this was like coming out with a new iPhone app. So that's how little he understood about what we're facing here. And I said, well, the problem with that is, let me just ask you a question. If you put $50 million into that research and development program and came out with a prototype of something that would run people's homes, take them off the grid self-sufficiency, lift the third world out of poverty in 3-4 years. 5 years at the most, with the way technologies can spread today in the world. But someone offered you $5 billion for your $50 million funding. What would you do? He says, I'm a businessman. I would sell. I said, no, you're a money whore. And you have just sold out the future of the world to another front organization that's going to bury it. Now, there's a term for this in our community that I use called black shelving. Black shelving means a corporate interest will buy up a technology because it is a threat to other horizontally and vertically integrated parts of their corporate structure, and just put it on a black shelf and keep it there. Now, there's a man who's a 747 pilot for United Airlines who's retired now, but he grew up with a gentleman who was inventing amazingly efficient carburetors in the 50s that were getting these heavy clunker cars, you know, those great big cars that were running and getting 80, 90 miles per gallon because of some of these electromagnetic things that he was in. Well, the auto companies and the oil companies kept buying him out. And he retired on that money. And his attitude was, I got mine, I'm rich now. One of the scientists, a lieutenant colonel down near the Huntsville Space Flight Center, Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, I was at his home, and he has worked a great deal in this area in classified projects. And he was looking at one. It was a gentleman who had an electromagnetic motor. And he tested it. And this is a PhD physicist, by the way. He said this was the real thing. This was not one of these frauds and tricks that are out there on the internet, most of which we'll get to in a moment are tricks and frauds. And he said this was the real thing. The guy disappeared for a few months, and next time he saw him, the guy had a Lamborghini and Armani suit, seriously, and wouldn't even talk to this physicist and said, I can't talk about that technology, it's been sold. That was in the 80s. That was 30-some years ago. Now there's another part. So if you get past the national security apparatus, there are all these business traps where if the money is initially clean, but the entity is controlled by people who are mainly interested in money and power, they're going to sell to someone who will black shelve it. It's not if that will happen, it's when. Because we have documented that this has happened over and over and over and over and over again. What I'm wanting to share with this first part of the presentation are where are all the pitfalls, because invariably, if you assert these technologies are possible, any thinking person is going to say, why aren't they out there? I'm trying to provide you with the why, okay, and also the how. Now you get to our humble efforts, and if you want to know more about the work of T. Townsend Brown and Tesla, and many, many, many others, they're on our website, and I'm not going to go through things that you can read there. I want to share things that, from our experience, that is unique to the access we've had and the experience we've had, which is, as they would say, unique and once in a generation opportunity. So some years ago, many years ago, I met a man who's a senior scientist at the Naval Research Labs down here. If you fly in the National Airport, you see all those radar domes. It's the largest Department of Defense lab in the United States. And very senior scientist, like very. You know, puts together stuff for the vice president, puts together stuff for admirals and joint staff and what have you. And I suspect if his name was known, he'd be the most famous aerospace designer of the last 30 years. But everything he's built has been for three-letter agencies, CIA and elsewhere. So he has been very, very interested and supportive of what we're doing. He understands the implications of the secrecy, the dark part. And so a few years ago, we have, as you see on our website, the Orion Project, which was a sort of a group that we put together We wanted to raise the funds to have our own lab, didn't get enough funds, so what we ended up doing is providing grants to people. Some of them were people who said they could do things they really couldn't. But you know, hey, you don't know. We're in a world emergency here, as I see it. So we were saying, like, we're not going to hoard this and sit on it. Let's put it out there. But one of the grants went to this brilliant, writ large engineer who had studied under William S. Bender at the University of Washington, a true genius, who in the 1970s had founded, after his studies, Transdimensional Technologies, a company that was working on these, and he actually did make a generator, energy generating device. I think it was 74, somewhere around there. And that device ended up getting seized by a national security order. And he describes, as if it was yesterday, these thugs in suits with an all-access pass badge coming in with a national security order, and they said, "You are now working for us, and that technology goes into what's called the vault, and all of your papers go into the vault, and you really don't have a choice." So for the last 40 years, he's worked for the national security state through a corporation that I know, and there's the details I don't want to go into for privacy reasons. And he basically does stuff for various agencies through this corporation. And he was introduced to me by this senior scientist at the Naval Research Labs and says, "You know what? This gentleman's shepherds," as they're called in the intelligence community, shepherds meaning the people who are holding your security clearances and sort of looking out for what you're doing, and he had 5 of them, have approved him working with you, Dr. Greer, and the Orion Project, and to do a basic prototype, Tesla-type prototype. But he is not allowed to do anything that flies. Because when I had gone down to his lab, and I went down to Huntsville and near the Redstone Arsenal and saw the lab. This gentleman had things that were floating around, nothing attached to them. It looked like miniature UFOs. Pretty cool stuff. The Naval Research Lab spent $1 million beefing that up and had things in their hangars floating around. And I've been in the NRL because people just bring me there because they want me to come in and share what I know, and I'll pick their brains and they'll pick mine. And I do not hold a security clearance, but I will not accept one. I tell people what I'm doing, and we don't want a security clearance. So what happens is that this guy says, "Look, I'll do this for you in my spare time," because he's still working full-time for this corporation doing stuff for the agency and other entities. I said, "Great, here's," I forget what we gave him, $60,000, $70,000. And about the time he was getting that thing built up, a team was sent down from the DC area to him, met with him at his SCIF, which is a Secure Communication Intelligence Facility, SCIF. Basically, it's an underground electromagnetic sealed facility. And in his SCIF, there was a former CIA director who had left the CIA and took a golden parachute into one of the big Beltway bandit corporations here in the DC area. And another team of people that basically threatened him, provided all kinds of false and defaming information about me that was outrageous. I mean, things like, I'm teaching people how to use consciousness to detonate weapons of mass destruction for Al-Qaeda. I mean, just insane stuff. I mean, you cannot imagine the full court press of defamation that attends trying to do something like what I'm doing. And basically, he got hold of us and said, I can't do this. I'm out here trying to do this at my house, in my own private lab. He had a secure lab that had a top secret clearance in his house. But he also had this other facility. But he says, I mean, my immediate intelligence shepherd said I could do this, but these guys have come in and have really threatened us. And I'm shut down. So we lost our money and didn't get anything. So we have done that to the tune of around $950,000 over the last decade. And all the work I've done on it, my family, my associates, have all worked pro bono. We've never been paid. And what we have learned from it are some very, very hard lessons that anyone listening to this needs to take to heart. Because there is a very narrow pathway out of the morass we're in. And because we've tried the others. We've tried providing grants to people. We've tried funding people who were not just, someone in a trailer park who had a wild idea. I mean, these were people with the provenance, their credentials. We visited, they've gone all over the world. Now, we have been caught in some outrageous scams. And I want to talk about some of those because the public has an idea that because you put something on YouTube, that's dispositive proof. It is not. It's sort of like my father-in-law used to say, paper does not refuse ink. If you want to just make something up. YouTube doesn't refuse an upload of a video. Nor does the internet refuse digits. You just put it out there. So it's a non-selective filter. Anything is up there. And a two-dimensional viewing on a YouTube is not a 3D proof that it is for real and that it's reproducible. So independent scientific validation and reproducibility, these are the sine qua non of science. And so we want to do this scientifically and very, very rationally. I won't give you an example. In a Latin American country, they went down to Mexico City a few years ago, and they had a device, small, and it was encased in resin or plastic. And you put it between, say, a fan and a wall socket. And you would, without it in there, you'd measure how, it was a kilowatt, you running this fan, a kilowatt of electricity. With it in there, it was only using 100 watts. And it was supposedly saving all this power because it had a secret circuit in there that was pulling energy in from the zero-point field that was solid state. I said, well, it's theoretically possible. So I schlep down there, look at it, bring one back. We're testing it, sure enough, and it turns out the Southwest Research Institute, which is a very big testing entity in Austin that a lot of mainstream entities use, tested it and gave the same report. And they had that report. So it looked like, well, it had passed muster here. But, big but, B-U-T, nobody knew what was in the little plastic thing. It was sealed, and it was a trade secret. And I went, this is risky, because it may be a trick. So Eugene Malov, who was MIT, had a PhD, MIT, Harvard, who was on our team, who was murdered, as many of you know, a few years ago. And some other scientists, including these folks at NRL and some other facilities, tested this magical power-saving device. And they said, well, sure enough, they're not lying about, it looks like if you just measure the energy. When we did an MRI scan on it, you know what we found? It had a circuit that was tricking the meter and making the meter run backwards, which can be done. It's called the power phase angle. Any engineers in here? And so very clever, multi-million-dollar scam that had taken him, and all it was doing was tricking the power. It was still using the same amount of power. It took untold thousands of dollars, and that was including everyone working for free, all these entities, Eugene Malov, my scientific team, everything, to get to the bottom of this. And that is why we will not pursue anything that is not open, transparent, and completely, if they're not willing to open their kimono fully, we'll say, you keep it and let someone else eat that snake oil. Ain't gonna be us. Now, I hate to be so blunt, but this is where you've really got to understand what we've been through. Now, you take that one example, and we've done that several dozen times all over the world at enormous cost to myself, enormous travel expenses, and in many times where people demand to have X amount put up as a retainer and da-da-da-da-da-da for you to even carry one away, and it's ended up to be this kind of a fraud. Now, this sounds like a real downer, doesn't it? And it is. But if you don't learn from these things, you're going to repeat them, which we will never do. I'm here to make a very special announcement. That's why we're here in this beautiful ballroom with a few lovely people who randomly were able to get here. Sirius Technology Advanced Research, which is a little group that we found that brought out the film Sirius and is doing a lot of this work now under that umbrella, is announcing a $100,000 challenge and award available to anyone who can deliver to us here in the Virginia area an operational device that meets certain criteria. Money's in the bank. Go to our website, you see it's been donated or it's there. Now, you say $100,000 isn't much money, but it actually is, because if you look at the fact that right now there is a quantum energy generator that's on the internet, it's supposed to be open source. There is information from the Keshe Foundation. There's information from other things that are now supposedly open source that people are saying. There's YouTube video showing it's doing this. And people have asked me why. In fact, one of our supporters for the Sirius film said, why don't you just go and build one? I said, look, to hook up our DVD player, my wife has to do that. I am such an idiot. You know, give me a defibrillator or a respirator, no problem, but that stuff, no. So look, I don't build, I'm not a machine guy with a lathe. So we would have to engage someone to do that. And people said, well, then why don't you? I said, because I have several thousand videos and several thousand documents in 2D purporting these claims. And it would take probably $100 million to build them all up. And how do you determine which one is legitimate? So we're turning this around the other way. If it is what people say it is, it's supposed to cost $5,000 to $7,000 to make one of these, even custom lathing, custom. You build it, you bring it. We're not going anywhere, because we've traipsed all over the world and it's been just a wild goose chase, to be honest with everyone. We will have it independently tested. And if it is legitimate, it has to have plans with it that are not secret and that nothing has been altered. That would allow us to independently reproduce it by somebody who is not associated with the inventor or the people who are advocates of the technology, truly an independent person. If it is not reproducible, it isn't science, and it isn't going to be made a billion copies to run 7 billion people's homes, cars, and what have you. And if it is not able to be tested transparently until proven otherwise, we're going to have to assume that there's a trick. Now, that's perhaps too harsh, but that's been our experience. And since we have expended almost $1 million already, going all over the world doing this, trying these other approaches, this is the approach that we're willing to go forward with that I think will work. And I think everything else is a waste of time, money, and resources. Now, what are the criteria for getting this award? Okay, number one, it cannot be something running off a wall socket, because there could be a circuit in there tricking the power phase angle. I just explained that. Cannot. If it's running on a battery pack or capacitors or something that starts up the system, those have to be completely recharged from the output while it carries a load. What do I mean by that? Let's say you've got this prototype, proof of principle thing, and it starts up, it needs 500 watts of power to start it up, and it runs, and then it kicks in, and it has a circuit where it is legitimately pulling in from the 0-point energy field, quantum vacuum flux field, if you want to call it that, the Dirac-C, whatever your favorite term is, and it's putting out 5 kilowatts of power. Well, if you have an output of 5 kilowatts, it should be no problem to take out of that 5 kilowatts and put the 500 watts back into the front end so that those batteries stay 100% charged. Got it? I can help design that circuit in my sleep, by the way, even if it has to be a switching circuit between batteries. Some people say, oh, you can't do that because it kills the thing. I said, good, then you put in a switching circuit on the front end batteries, but no tricks. And then it's running 4.5 kilowatts of usable excess electricity to run appliances or what have you. I'm just using this as an example. Now, it could be something that only it takes 100 watts in that stays charged from output, and a kilowatt's coming out. So you have 900. For a proof of principle thing, it doesn't have to be something that's going to be ready to go to manufacture. It has to be something that I can put in front of the people that I meet with week in and week out and week in and week out who want to see a solution like this. They really do, but they haven't seen it. And when I tell them, well, I've seen them at this SCIF or at this lab, and they go, yeah, but I want to see one. And you know what? The public needs to see one. But they need to see it with independent testing by people who are going to publish and put their name to the fact that I tested this prototype and this is what it is doing. And then another laboratory says, I've taken the plans that were provided for the prototype and I have independently recreated the effect. Reproducibility, at least once, if not 3 times, which is what we'd use the rest of the funds for that we've been able to have donated and made through the film series. So the $100,000, we call it the Serious Challenge and Award. And it's $100,000 for anyone who can legitimately bring, we're not going to go to the outback of Australia to look at a kinda, shoulda, proulda, maybe. It's got to be brought here, not to DC, but to Virginia, near the University of Virginia. And it has got to be able to pass these criteria. It also cannot have anything in it that is hazmat, hazardous material. Now, why do I say that? We have tested and looked at some devices that were using low-level radioactive materials. Not good. You can make a dirty weapon out of that. It's never going to be able to be mass manufactured. So it can't have hazmat. It can't have anything really toxic in terms of hazmat chemicals. It cannot have a effect that is harmful to the environment. So it'll be tested for environmental effects. What do I mean? Well, I mentioned this gentleman who's this incredible trans-dimensional physicist and engineer down near Huntsville. He had a experiment he was doing that actually created a vector and created a space-time bubble. And amazingly, you know, like he accidentally dropped a bolt into this energy field and it vanished. You could put a broom handle into it and that part of it would go into another dimension. This sounds like science fiction. It is not. The senior scientist in Naval Research Labs, who I know very well, who has stayed at our home, I've known him for many years, saw this. But unfortunately, when he was experimenting with that, it created an energy field where a scientist who was standing next to it, half of his body got hit by that. And half of his body is aging at twice the rate of the other half, literally. Sounds like something out of the outer, limits or whatever they used to call that. So these technologies, it has to be something that's safe. It also needs to be something that is not going to disrupt FCC channels, Federal Communication. In other words, if you switch that on and your local FM radio station goes offline, you're going to get a knock on the door. Or if you switch it on and all cell phones are disabled. Or if you switch it on, and this is an effect of these sciences. You know, there's a guy who works in the science director at CIA and that I've known for 20 years. And he says, we have a name for these things, WSFM, Weird Science and Frickin' Magic. And my uncle worked on the Apollo landing, the lunar module. And at Northrop Grumman, they just call it PFM, Pure Frickin' Magic. And it is. It's the high end of electromagnetic, mainly magnetic field sciences that result in all kinds of phenomena. So you have to be careful. You have to know what you're doing. And some people have known and some haven't. So there are effects. So it would have to be able to pass the test that there's not a biohazard, an FCC communication hazard to normal bandwidths of cell phones and radio and TV, because you don't, or what have you, or create inadvertently a blackout electromagnetically in an adjacent building. I know one guy who was experimenting with this, and every time he turned on his system, everyone's garage doors in his neighborhood were going up and down like this, seriously. So these are all things that are going to have to be evaluated. In 24 years of me being involved with this, I now know what to look for, which someone starting out would take them 24 years to discover. And the device also, meeting this challenge, has to be stable. What do I mean by that? Let's say it works in Massachusetts, but you move it from Massachusetts to Virginia, and the electromagnetic and magnetic field of the Earth is different in Virginia than it is there. And even from place to place, you can go to places in Colorado where there's huge changes in the Gaussian, the measurement of magnetic field at one point versus another, even in one valley. If it works in one point and doesn't work in the other, that's a problem. Unless you've developed an algorithm of how to attune it to adjust for the magnetic field variations that surround Earth. That is a serious technical issue. Believe me, I tell you, I have seen things that absolutely work in one point, you move it, doesn't work. That's not what we call robust. So the technology has to be open source. The person cannot want a patent or want to keep it secret. It has got to be something that can be openly shared with the public. It has to be stable. It has to be free of hazardous effects. It needs to be something that's putting out a measurable over unity amount of power, meaning more than what's going in, with the input power continuously charged. And it needs to be able to run in a stable fashion for a sustainable amount of time. What do I mean by sustainable? At least a day. Now, we were once involved in an operation out of the Caribbean, and a man had sort of resurrected the Tesla Stubblefield earth battery. Everybody know what that is? You put these zinc and copper poles in the earth, and you actually can run. And he had, several hundred watts of electricity coming out of this thing. But it would only work for about 20 minutes, 15 minutes, and then it would go cut off. We went, why? Why is it cutting off in 20 minutes? Something not right. Well, we thought maybe it just needed more engineering. So we took this. It turns out that the electrolyte content of the soil, it took a genius to discover this from documents from Russia from the early part of the 20th century. There has to be a certain electrolyte composition of the soil to feed and be flowing through these copper and zinc alternating pipes for that Stubblefield Tesla battery. We have pictures of it on our website, to operate on a sustainable basis. And that was the secret that the inventor, not the inventor, the guy trying to reproduce it didn't know, but he didn't want to admit he didn't know it. So he started playing a scam on us, which cost us a couple $100,000. So that's why it has to be something that can work on a reliable basis for a sustained amount of time. Because if it conks out in 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes, there's something fishy going on. And to troubleshoot that failure could very well cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, literally, to get to the bottom of it with some of the most brilliant people in the world who know this particular area of electromagnetic phenomena. And that's a very, very small number of people that we know of who can actually work on this with us, who aren't assigned to the agency or to Lockheed Skunk Works or what have you. So we have to do this in a way that has our eyes wide open, having learned what we have over the last few dozen or so years. If someone has such a thing, and I'm convinced it's out there, they need to contact us. And there will be on our website an application and a questionnaire so that we can do an initial intake review of it. And then they will be, if it passes all those evaluation criteria, they will be invited to come to have it tested. But they also must leave with it the plan so it can be reproduced. Because if they have, for example, done something that works and it's legitimate, but they do something like Stan Meyer did, where he left out or just changed by a few thousand voltages what the voltage or the hertz needs to be, no one will be able to reproduce it. And that doesn't help the planet. And we're not willing to do it. It has got to be independently reproducible by not me, and not someone who's an advocate of new energy, but just a person who is skilled in the art of fabrication, machining, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, a team that can do that. And if that can't be done, and if the person can't do it, and it also has to be done in a way so that the person isn't going back and forth with the inventor. Because if the plans can't, if they're not truly well thought through plans, where a skilled person can do it, like a proper formula, then the science may not be there. It may be a bunch of guesswork, where you have to do an iterative thing. And where, now that we have seen this, where there have been scientists who have stumbled across an effect, but they didn't keep, or they didn't even know how to document what the voltage and frequency was when they hit that sweet spot. And so every time they try to create a device, it's a bunch of guessing for months, and sometimes years, because they're not following a very rigorous scientific method, or they don't have the right equipment. What do I mean by right equipment? It is not a trivial thing to be doing things with very high voltages and very high frequencies, because you can't buy that from a normal Kawasaki analyzer or even your testing equipment. That's custom stuff. And so to be able to do this properly, if it is something that requires that, you know, if the person hasn't been able to document it and then do a second version of it based on documentation, it may be that they just accidentally stumbled across an effect, but they don't know, honestly, what they did. And I know such a scientist in Canada who will admit this. He did have the effect. It actually was something that lifted, but he had no idea exactly what he did. And no one since has been able to reproduce it. So again, the sine qua non of science, independent testing and verification, and independent, transparent reproducibility, at least once, if not 2 or 3 times. So that's the requirement for this STAR challenge and award. I'm hoping someone steps up to the challenge and gets the award. I mean, the $100,000 is sitting there in the bank, so come take it. But it's going to have to meet this criteria. It cannot be snake oil, and it cannot be secret, and it has to be open source. We do not want to talk to anyone, let me be very clear, who wants this secret, patented, or in any way an intellectual property issue. It is our intent to do this as an open source, like there's some open source software, Linux, or I don't know what it is. I'm not a software guy. I'm just a doctor from Virginia. But the truth of this is, if the person is out there, or if some of these open source things that have just surfaced in the last year on the internet are legitimate, and they really do only cost $5,000 to $7,000 for someone to make it, then they can get a pretty nice return for their trouble. There's a certain problem and a certain value to notoriety or contacts. So the nice thing about our network, it's now very large. I can easily reach pretty much any world leader in the world with something that would be legitimate. There are, as you may have gotten from my comments, a number of very high net worth people who don't want to do this until it's a chicken egg. They don't want to get involved till they see there's something working, but we don't have something working until someone gets us something. And it's this chicken egg thing. So, and these are not people who are just, you know, wanting to be first to be second. They're sincere people, but they say, I got to see something that can be independently tested and verified. It cannot be hearsay on YouTube. So we have built this massive network that is very substantial for the last 20 years, and it would be immediately activated. The other thing that would be immediately activated, and I want to talk about our strategy, because it's like, what's the day after you get something that's confirmed? Well, first of all, it's going to be all over the internet. The reports, just like we did for the Atacama humanoid, from Dr. Lockman and the people at Stanford, are going to be on the internet. If you can read the report. So it'll be prestigious universities and academics who will have tested it and said, this is what it is. They may say, we don't know where the energy's coming from, because if they were trained in classic or even quantum physics, they're not going to know a whole lot about the zero-point energy field and quantum vacuum and all this. But they can verify the energy input and output, that there are no tricks, and the lab will be able to say, from these plans, we were able to reproduce it. Now, we have many, many contacts who can do that part of it, but that would have to be released to the public in a very large national press club or similar event, but where you would have the provenance, the device there, you would have the testing reports there blown up, and you would have the pedigree for who the people were who reproduced it and tested it. Because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So one of the few things I agree with Carl Sagan on. And I think in this case, that's what you have to do, but it has to be a massive release to the public very quickly. Because here's the other thing that people working, like the group that took the Stenmeyer materials, they do not understand that time is your enemy. All right, the longer you perseverate and sit on something like this with the public not knowing, the riskier it is. It's very dangerous. So you would want to get, you don't want to jump the gun and say you have something when you don't. On the other hand, at the instant you're certain, and I mean 100% certain scientifically, you want to do a massive. Now that would require a funding, because just to do the PR and the public education on this would run probably into the $2 or $3 million. But I think that's less. That won't be so difficult once we have something operational. I'll just say. A foundation I recently met with, the head of that foundation wants to help us, and he's raised for his foundation several $100 million in the last few years. And so there are a lot of people watching what we're doing who are interested, but they're wanting, it's sort of like that old commercial, where's the beef? They're wanting to see something. And I've been in the trenches looking for that, where that really is, and our story of this has been both very, very promising, because I've seen things that actually do work, but then also incredibly disappointing to see how they disappear and get suppressed. One of the reasons we do not want to fund any of these sort of inventors and scientists, even ones that had the bona fides of this gentleman down at the Huntsville Space Flight Center in the Redstone Arsenal, is because if they're a lone wolf doing this somewhere, no one knows who they are because they're an obscure person, that obscurity is dangerous. Obscurity is dangerous. And this harkens back to, how my life has been ruined by being a public person on all this, where if I walk into a Whole Foods, people know who I am, many times will come up, which is fine, and I don't find it at all flattering. It's more often annoying than anything. But the fact is that millions of people are following what we're doing. When the film Sirius came out, the Huffington Post had it was the biggest story for almost a week on the Huffington Post. Millions and millions and millions of people reading about it. So we have a certain reach that a small inventor can't have. And what I want to do is say, if you can bring us the payload, we'll launch it. So we're the launch, and we'll disclose it. And I don't care if someone threatens my life or offers me $2 billion. An intelligence director had, back in 1992, offered me $2 billion personally, and then went to my wife and tried to convince her to convince me to shut down what I was doing. I said, I don't care about $2 billion. So you cannot be bought, and you cannot be afraid. And I guess because I had a near-death experience when I was young, I'm not afraid of death, and so you just have to go. Now, one of the things that was interesting after we were in New York this past week, as I mentioned, we were at dinner meeting with a number of people, some very, very high net worth people, and we were talking about this. And someone said, well, what's the guarantee that if you had your own lab, you could just do? I said, a guarantee? I think, go ask my great whatever grandfather, who was called as one of the first prisoner of war with the British during the American Revolution, what the guarantee was that little experiment called the American Revolution would have worked. I mean, if we are all so averse to risk that we're not willing to do something this important for the world, for our children and our children's children, and for Gaia, which is a living, breathing being, then who are we? What are we as a people? I mean, if there was that level of a lack of courage and this sort of putting your finger in the wind and seeing what the safe path is, there would have never been the American Revolution. All of us would be goose-stepping to Adolf Hitler's great-grandson, et cetera, and so on. So at a certain point, we have got the events, the courage to do this. But we have to put that around something. Now, I'm willing to do that part of it, as are a number of wonderful people I've been working with for many years, some of whom are not known in the public and frankly don't need to be known in the public. In fact, they'll say, you do that. But I think that that's why if we as a people come together and say, how can we support this? So that's one pathway to disclosing a device. Here's a challenge, here's the criteria, here's the award. There's another one, and that was the impetus for the film Sirius. Now, the film Sirius, as you all know, has been phenomenal. It was the largest crowdfunded documentary in history, period, to this day. It has been seen by millions of people in the world, but most of the people who've seen it have seen it on pirated sites for free. The intent of the film was that it would become sort of a rallying calls for the public to provide the donation so that we could open out near the University of Virginia where we live in a wonderful area where there are a lot of talent. A research and development lab, the budget of which is on the website, seriousdisclosure.com. It's about $6.4 million, which most VC people, venture capital people, when they hear that number, they go, are you crazy to open a whole lab with all this high-tech stuff and 18 people? I said, well, it's only for a 2-year period. That's just the budget. I am highly confident that if we had that budget and that funding, we would be there, because I'm sitting on, just let's say, some intellectual property given to me by a brilliant engineer who was being recruited by the CIA, and part of their recruitment was to let him go into secret files and copy things to study, which he kept and which he's now given to me. It's thousands of pages of amazing stuff. But again, it's pages two-dimensional. You got to build it up, and for that you need a team, and for that you need funding. Now, we have only raised maybe less than $250,000 out of the $6.4 million for the Energy Lab. And you can go to our website, and there's a little ticker we change every month or two. And that's mainly because most people think someone else is going to do this. To the people who have contributed, who are in this room, thank you very much. But you cannot open a research facility for that. The equipment list runs to $500,000, and that is really pared down. So we don't even have half of what the equipment would be, never mind the building, 18 personnel with payroll, benefits, everything. Because these brilliant engineers and scientists that I've met, they're not going to leave their day jobs where they're making $150,000 a year, $200,000 a year as an engineer with benefits to work for free because they have a family, they have kids in college. I mean, let's live in the real world for a nanosecond. You know, you have got to have the ability. I was crazy enough to leave my profession, and I have personally foregone around $8 million in income to do what I'm doing. And I have the most amazing wife ever that has been supportive of me doing this because she understands what's at stake. But most families would not put up with that. And most people wouldn't do it. And you can't expect them to. So we have to be compassionate about the fact that people have basic needs to live. I mean, no one needs to get rich off this. We want to do it and put it out open source, but they have to have food on the table, and if their kids are in college and what have you, they have to have health care and blah, blah, blah. And then you have to have some degree of technology support, project management, and tactical security. Everybody know the difference between tactical and strategic security. Tactical means you got cameras there, it's streamed on YouTube, you have certain secure areas so that people can't come in and just sabotage what you're doing and change a circuit. Okay, so you have to have security. Strategic security is what we already have that we built over the last 20 years, and that is all of you guys, the public, and all the people who are in the public but are in high positions waiting for something to happen, who are all the guys and women and agencies who are saying, we want to be first to be second. We don't want to be first to be first, because this is too disruptive, it's too controversial. And you know what? If you study the history of the world, the big changes that have happened have never come from the centers of power, right? Whether it was Rome or now the United States, the Pax Americana, it's never coming from your sort of hidebound academic, corporate, and governmental centers of power always comes from out here. Somebody in their basement inventing something like Stephen Jobs did, or what have you. So this is something that I think similarly, but it has a unique challenge that a normal technology doesn't face. And that is, if you come up with a better computer, Hewlett-Packard may not like you, or even Apple may not like you, but it will come out there. There's no prevailing national security problem with that until you get to the uber supercomputers, which NSA are working on. But if you do something like this that changes the entire way the world operates, and the need for even a petrodollar, and the need for oil and gas and coal and utilities and nuclear power, it is such a huge change. I'm going to say something here that people may take as hyperbole, but it is not. If you were to add up every technological development from the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s to now, and added it all up, the internal combustion engine, cars, planes, trains, jets, rockets, the internet, integrated circuits, biotechnology, medical, everything. This one area of physics, science, and technology, absolutely, in terms of its economic effect, its change in the way the world will operate, eclipses all of them in their aggregate. So 150 years of industrial development, this one area will be larger, which is needed. Now, people say, well, that's kind of very futuristic. I'm going, no, it's back to the future, because we should have had these technologies beginning to be developed and released 100 years ago, except there were cartels like Standard Oil and JP Morgan and other folks who didn't want it out then, and there are other cartels that don't want it out now. The people who have a stake aren't all in that camp, but they also don't want to step out in front of this freight train. Some people have asked me, aren't there some people, there's a man who is, and again, the reason I don't want to name names, it's like Eleanor Roosevelt said, I'm going to paraphrase, great minds discuss ideas, mediocre minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people, which is really true. Unfortunately, we've become very tabloid, internet tabloid, and people want to just gossip. So I don't like doing that. But there was a man who, back in, after the Disclosure Project, National Press Club, a few years later, had been watching what we were doing, and he was a billionaire, and has a place out in Virginia. And he sometimes would let us use he had 5 private jets, so you could go here and there, and it was fun. But he lived on 1,500 acres and had this house that looked like a UFO with bulletproof glass, and then had a mountain that he had leveled off so one of his small jets could land there, and a helipad. And then his wife had the antebellum mansion on the other part of the estate. Very interesting guy. And he actually had his son, the day after Thanksgiving one year, land his helicopter in my meadow to pick up a grocery bag like you'd get from Kroger of disclosure videos and material to take back to his father. And my mother was going, Stephen, what are you doing? Is what you're doing dangerous? Why is this man landing? My poor mother. Anyway, so welcome to my world. It has not been, I think of my children, couldn't have been easy being raised this way. So, it's Thanksgiving dinner, wonderful, the day after, and here this guy's landing a high altitude helicopter in our meadow. But the scion of this family, very interested in all this, so he eventually invites me out to his estate, and we meet, and he has pictures of himself with Ronald Reagan and all these people from all over the world, and I'm going, oh, cool. So he was very nice. He made a $100,000 donation to Disclosure Project so we could publish and move out the briefing materials into the disclosure book and all that stuff, and get it at a very inexpensive cost during that period out to as many people as we could, kind of subsidized. And I said, well, that's great, thank you very much. I said, well, what we really want to work on right now, the next phase of disclosure, because we've done the thing with all the witnesses and stuff, and there were 800 million people, by the way, around the world saw that. Let's do the next phase and bring out the technology. He says, oh no, Hey, this guy's 85 years old. And I said, look, you know, I mean, come on, you're in your 80s. Let's take a chance on this. He says, no, it's too dangerous. Now, this is a guy who, out the tailpipe of his Gulf Streams, and he had 5 jets, could have funded this entire energy research lab, no problem. I mean, it's this unbelievable amount of wealth. But he says, no, I mean, back in the late 60s, I knew the head of General Motors, because this man was an industrialist. And I said, yeah, so? And we're having lunch at his home, at this flying saucer house. It was hilarious. And I said, well, what did you learn? He says, I learned that GM already had these technologies, that they were on a black shelf, but that this executive felt that it was time to end the secrecy on it, and so that every GM car coming off the conveyor belt would be electric, but not have to be plugged in. A true electric car, like what Tesla ought to have. And 2 weeks later, this executive was found dead of an apparent suicide. And he said, every single one of us knew that this man was not suicidal. But he was doing this from within GM and in a clandestine, in a way that was very quiet, and he was making too much noise, and he's dead. Now I said, well, can you prove that he was killed by some dark elements? He says, no, but everyone knew that's what happened. And I said, for that reason, I'm not willing to help. I said, what if you move the money through an offshore entity? No, they'll know where the money came from. Because they would. They'd absolutely know instantly. And he says, well, are you afraid for your own safety? He says, oh, I don't care, I'll be dead in a couple years. Here's his old curmudgeon, fantastic. He says, but I have my children and my grandchildren fly around on my planes, and there could be a malfunction. He says, I'm not willing to do that. How many billionaires like that have I met with? More than a dozen. Every time it's a similar line. It's either, I don't want to get involved in this, something this controversial, or I'm afraid something could happen to my interests or whoever, or so the ones who know how the national security superstate works, which is ruthless, rogue, and criminal, don't want to step in, touch this third rail and get zapped. The ones who don't know are just sort of, if they don't know about that, then what their concern is that their peerage will be upset with them. What do I mean by peerage? People that they work with who would be adversely affected by such a disclosure of a technology like this. I remember being at Lawrence Rockefeller's ranch out in the Tetons, the JY Ranch, which, those of you who don't know, the Rockefeller family gave the whole Grand Teton National Park to the U.S. government, but they kept out a really beautiful ranch there at the base of Teton Peak. And he had me out there with a group of other people back some years ago, and before he passed away. And Lawrence, David Rockefeller, Chase Manhattan Bank, was the one wanting disclosure. David did not. David was the big banker guy, petrodollar, boom, no, hell no. One night I was out under the stars with Lawrence and everyone else. They sort of, he wanted some FaceTime just with me. And we were out under the stars, beautiful, crystal clear, with one of the original Remington statues of a Native American on a horseback looking up at the stars like this, beautiful. And Lawrence turned to me, he says, we really need you to get this done. I'm working full-time as an emergency doctor, taking care of shootings and stabbings and car wrecks and 4 children and a golden retriever and blah, a normal life, mostly at that point. I use the word normal very broadly. I think normalcy is greatly overrated. But anyway, and I said, well, I need your help. He says, well, I can do things behind the scenes, but I'm not going to do anything. I said, are you afraid for yourself? He says, oh no. He says, but there are members of my family already raising hell with me that I'm even doing this much. Because as you know from the Project Starlight documents that I started, that were the AP, the Associated Press sued the Clinton Library. He was hosting the President and First Lady there, the best available evidence and all this was being presented. There were a lot of discussions going on during the Clinton years. So he said, no, I mean, I have family members who are really, really upset that I'm doing this much. So blood is thicker than water. So in that case, he didn't want to, he wanted to keep the peace in the family. So there are all kinds of reasons why various people that we've been able to meet with, what we have got to do, we either need to find a way that the public will really support the funding, which is so far, as I said, is about 4% of what we need, or we have to find maybe a dozen people who can put in $500,000 or $600,000 each, so we need someone to head up that because I don't know anything about fundraising. I mean, I'm a doctor. So that's just not my wheelhouse. Or we need to have someone bring us a technology that's operational that can be open source, which is why we're launching this STAR Challenge and Award. And I'm hopeful that while we tried that many years ago, 10 years later, perhaps there are people out there who really are ready to come forward with something open source. Or if there is something open source on the internet, as is being claimed, someone builds it up and can get it to us so we can move it out. Why is that important? Why isn't just having it on YouTube enough? How are you going to stand up a whole new industry? This is not just like like a 16-year-old can do an app and put it on the internet and become a centimillionaire. Great. This, you actually have to build something because it's actually tangible. It's not virtual. So how are you going to get to the poor of the world for their villages and homes this type of generator? Someone has to build them. Someone is going to have to build the thing that's going to replace the engine in your car. And it ain't going to be General Motors. Someone's going to have to build the thing that's going to replace your heat pumps at your house so that those are just a generator system that runs your house off the grid. Someone is going to have, and that is a heavy industry that is going to have to be, I hate to use the word, capitalized. And the cap on this, it's huge. It's like the Marshall Plan that we had for Europe, to rebuild Europe. This is like the Marshall Plan for the whole planet. And we're in an emergency. So we're going to, once we get to this first stage, then we're going to have to recruit stakeholders and people who really do want to see this change. Because once the genie's out of the bottle, I think that'll happen. What the indications I got at this meeting I was at with these 120 leaders from various sectors from around the world was that there's a certain number of people who, once this is out and inevitable, they're happy to be first to be second and they'll jump on. So we need to create that initial push. And that's what we're asking people to help us do. One of the documents that I put in this brief, this is the initial briefing we put together for President Obama shortly after he got into office. And I keep it here at this building for reasons of briefing. It's not the only copy, don't worry. But in it, one of the documents that I was very key to emphasize was the 1951 document from Canada, from Wilbur Smith, a top secret document that got accidentally declassified that states that this is the most sensitive issue in the history of the United States. It is the most secret. That there's a team headed up by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was the guy who was the czar over the whole Manhattan Project, that Edward Teller and Oppenheimer, but if you look him up in history, Vannevar Bush was one of the key people and that team headed up the study of these so-called flying saucers, as they were called back, how quaintly, in 1950 when that document came out. And the secrecy around that was so great that in this memo it states not only do these flying saucers exist, and there's a group studying the modus operandi, I'm quoting, the method of action and technology behind them, but that it was more secret than the development of the hydrogen bomb. Now remember, the H-bomb Everybody know the difference between an atomic bomb and a nuclear bomb? Most people don't. An atomic bomb is fissile material. Okay, so what we unfortunately dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a very, in a sense, low yield fission reaction where you split the atom. A thermonuclear bomb has that within it, and then it goes to a fusion, like the sun reaction, and it's 100,000 times more powerful. And so the H-bomb, the hydrogen bomb, which are what is the standard use today in the world, at least by America and others, is a thermonuclear fusion bomb, uncontrolled, which is much more powerful than an atomic bomb. Most people have no idea the difference between atomic and, I mean, these get conflated, but I want to be clear. I mean, there was no reason for us not to be educated in 2014. And so we'll have questions later at the last hour, because it's not mic'd. So what you have to understand is that that was the ultimate doomsday weapon, the hydrogen bomb. And this memo, which has never been contested, states that the project's dealing with the modus operandi, the technologies of these UFOs, was a bigger secret in the United States than the hydrogen bomb. So if you just think about the implications of that for a moment, then you begin to realize what kind of things would be done to keep this genie in the bottle, and has been done. Now, did it start in the 40s, 50s? No. T. Townsend Brown, many of you know of the RAND Corporation. He became someone who was a key figure in the development of the RAND Corporation. T. Townsend Brown, and all this information is at SeriousDisclosure.com. If you click on the energy button and go to all the links, there are documents, there's all this. He was the man who figured out that if you put a certain type of high voltage resonant field using crystalline structures, that you would get lift. And actually, the crystals would begin to look like they were expanding, and did expand, take up more space. Amazing. And they would cause a lifting effect. That was in the late 20s, 1920s. The Kautsky-Frost experiment that was then done in 1928 or 29 in Germany reproduced that, but did even more work on it. So it isn't as if this all started after Roswell or something. There were classified projects looking into this effect of very high voltage systems, lift effect, mass cancellation. So if something becomes massless, anybody know your physics equations? Velocity is equal to, but it's inversely proportional to the mass. So go run your equation, and when mass disappears, theoretically, velocity can go to infinity. But what actually happens when it becomes massless and a massless particle, boom, it's actually in another dimension. So this is why you can get these objects. If you look at our radar tapes, if you look at the Disclosure Project witnesses at SeriousDisclosure.com, thanks to the work of some folks who worked with me for the last 15 or 20 years, we have several dozen of these people up there. And one of them, John Callahan, was doing the case with the airline, Japan Airlines in Alaska in the early 80s. And you know, he was flying along on the polar route, 747, and this massive UFO, extraterrestrial vehicle actually is what they're called, ETVs, it's what they're called in NSA, National Security Agency, appeared, and it was the size of a destroyer or larger on the ocean, but it was up in the air. And with one radar sweep, it would then be 180 degrees the other way, moving completely non-linearly, or in ways that were inexplicable to anyone flying a jet, all right, or a rocket. So that radar tape, we have the original for, because this chief of the investigation unit for the FAA took it with him when he retired and gave it to the Disclosure Project. So it's in my vault. You get the sense of this then, that anyone who's gotten close to the subject knows that we're not dealing with your granddad's Oldsmobile or jet or rocket. And that is the crux of the problem, is that it is such a big leap in technology from where we are now that a lot of people say, it's great, but it's too disruptive. And as the man at the university club told me, No one who gets into a powerful position in government wants to have to deal with that much change. It's just too much change to deal with. Now, unfortunately, it would have been a manageable change between 1910 and 1930, but we missed that window. And I wasn't alive then anyway, so I couldn't have helped you out. Neither was anyone else in this room, I suspect, unless you've aged very well. You're not 100 years old. So the question becomes, why hasn't someone, if these technologies are real, done something with it? Well, they have. And it turns out, if you look at the history of this, T. Townsend Brown started out in the open world and then got pulled in by the military with his anti-gravity work that then got pulled into the RAND Corporation. We have people like Stan Meyer. And you've heard this, people think, is it an urban myth or not that Mr. Meyer had a car running on water that had one of these electrolyzers that would take water dissociated into hydrogen and oxygen and run it in real time without a fuel cell, without storing it? Yes, he did. Unfortunately, he falsified all his patents, which vitiated their legal viability because he didn't want anyone to know his little secret. And then he died mysteriously after he was meeting with some people from NATO. Ran out of a Cracker Barrel in somewhere, I think, in Tennessee, and collapsed in the parking lot saying, "I've been poisoned, I've been poisoned, I've been poisoned." Now, my team has met with his twin brother who actually did the circuits for him in the 80s and 90s. And this is a very doable, reproducible experiment if we had a laboratory, which is what we've been calling for the funding to do. But what Stan Meyer did, and this is something I'm going to go into, what have been the mistakes? How can we learn from the mistakes I've made in the last 15 years, but the mistakes others have made in the last 24. So if I were to drop dead tonight, one of the reasons I'm making this film is I'd like for people to know, have the benefit of what I've gone through and what I've learned, because it is not obvious. It is very counterintuitive. Like most inventors, and I've never had this mindset, Stan Meyer felt that, well, he can monetize this by keeping it, the little secret formula, putting a patent into the patent office, but not putting all the detail in so no one else could really reproduce it. But of course, if you can't reproduce the technology from the patent is useless, as you know, and you can talk to any patent attorney. That's the whole point of a patent, is to protect it. Otherwise, you keep it a trade secret, like the secret ingredients of Coca-Cola. And what happened is that he died before he could really find a way to move it out, because about the time his little invention became known, where even wastewater could be used to run your house or car through a generator just burning hydrogen and oxygen gas, which has zero pollution because you have water vapor as the tailpipe, which you can actually put back into the system and keep using it, the water. You're just pulling out the energy equivalent of the bonds, the atomic bonds, and the way that you're breaking them at very low power is what I'm going to keep referring to as this magic sweet spot. High voltage and very specific resonant frequencies depending on the substrate. By substrate, I mean water, crystalline material, air, magnetic coils. So you think of those as substrates, but the principle is what you need to understand. It's very high voltage, specific resonance, and we're not talking 110 or 220, thousands or millions of volts at very, very specific cycles per second, resonances, depending on the material. That opens what's called a Poynting vector into the zero-point energy field and bound. Then you're going to hit that sweet spot. You're going to go, quote, over unity, meaning you're getting more power out than in. But unfortunately, Stan Meyer, while he had an authentic system, and he had really, people say, how did he come across this? An accidental empirical observation, which is really the sort of the springboard of many sciences, an accidental observation by someone who's astute. And he worked at a radar plant, and he observed that under certain frequencies and voltages, water just went. It was quite an accidental observation. He went, wow, because H2O, 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, you can burn it. And when you burn it, there's no pollution. All you have is water vapor from the result of burning it. So he went, wow. So he started experimenting, and his twin brother Steve helped him eventually develop the circuits. Now, because he wanted to keep this secret, and he did not disperse in an open source way that technical information, everyone who's tried to reproduce it hasn't been able to, because they haven't, A, understood the concepts very well, and then even if they have been approached eventually and threatened. And we're going to talk about the suppression and the threats that go with this kind of technology, which is real. And when he was developing this, he eventually discovered that he could use a material that was in a magnetically charged sort of liquid in a toroid. A toroid is a donut, looks like a, okay. And this was an electromagnetic generator, didn't burn any so-called Brown's gas or water turning it into hydrogen and oxygen. And this object was the big secret of his portfolio that we were trying to acquire a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, those of you who followed our work. The heirs of the Stanmeyer collection wanted to sell it. And we had a few $100,000, but we didn't have millions. So we lost. And it went to a corporation that's in Michigan, which is all we need to talk about, that has been working on it since. And they are making the identical mistake that Stanmeyer made. They're doing it secretively. I was recently called in a panic by one of their funders out of the United Kingdom, who stated to me that they had gotten these systems to operate, including the toroid, which means that you have a solid state, basically a solid state system with some magnetically charged material in it, and it'll run your house. Now that device had a national security order slapped on it. And most people, Stanmeyer never spoke of it because he was told, if you speak of this, you're violating the National Security Act, and we'll seize it, and you'll be in prison. So we knew this from someone who had worked very, very, very closely, because this man who had worked closely with Stanmeyer said, forget the car running on water. That's nothing. Look for the toroid. So when we went there to the storage facility where all this stuff was kept, it was there. And all the binders and all the inventor's books and all the manual, everything was there. We went, oh, wow. We made appeals to the public. You know, I'm a doctor and I'm doing okay, but I'm not rich enough to just lay out several $1 million. I can't write a check like that. So we did what we could, but we lost. Now, when Stanmeyer had this, of course, he wasn't prepared to go mano a mano with the national security state because he was afraid. I mean, they made it very clear. You're going to prison, and that's that, or worse. At a certain point, after he passed away, that all this stuff, as I said, went into storage. So from 1996 to 2009, whenever it was, a few years ago, it was just sort of, nobody knew what happened to it. Then it surfaced. And we were really trying to do it. The tragedy of today is that in the last month or so, I got this phone call. And I had predicted at the time that that collection disappeared. I said, if it's going to be handled the way these people are stating they're going to handle it, which is to do it secretively, trying to corporatize, monetize, and privatize this technology, first of all, it's going to take them several years to get it operational because these were traditional engineers who didn't understand the physics. So you've got to get the right physicists and engineers on your team. And folks like myself who've seen these things in labs. We'll talk about this. I've been to classified labs where I've seen them operating. The second thing is that you have got to do it. Cameras rolling, streamed on Ustream. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Would Silicon Valley ever buy into this, or Microsoft or Google or Apple? No, because everything's about patents and secrecy and getting over on your competitor. But if you play that secrecy game, guess who's going to be watching everything you're doing in real time, keystroke by keystroke on every computer in your lab? the National Security Agency, and the National Security State. The instant you hit the eureka moment, they're coming in with an NSO, a National Security Order, and you're shut down. That's what happens. And unfortunately, that is what has now happened to this group out of Michigan, where they are being threatened, and they are trying to relocate their entire lab to a friendly country. So I talked to this man out of the United Kingdom, I won't say what his name is, who's been helping fund it, I mean millions of dollars. And I said, look, there are no friendly countries. You put this in the Amazon jungle, there's a E-Systems Raytheon facility there with security people who will come in. Where are you going to go on this planet that's beyond the reach of the, what I call transnational superstate of security? Because it is transnational. So there's this naivete, and I'm speaking now to all you inventors out there and all you people who live in the world of inventions and patents and secrecy. There's no place you can hide, and there's no place you can run. Believe me. Please believe me when I tell you this. And therefore, you must do it openly with the whole world watching. Good phrase from the 60s, the whole world's watching. Now, 10 years ago, you couldn't have done that. There wasn't Ustream and Yahoo and whatever, YouTube and all this stuff. Now there is. So, not the bathrooms of the lab, but all the workstations of the lab, real-time streamed on the internet. And invite people to see it. Someone comes in with a national security order, you caught them red-handed. And then I'm on every network I can get on, and I've been on almost every network in the world saying, the technologies that would save the environment, get us off oil, are being ruthlessly suppressed by a rogue group of people who are not being supervised by the President and the Congress, and without the consent of the people. This is an illegal act, and we need people to help us. Democracy. As you know, we've just launched this ET Contact app, which is fun. It's kind of more of a website than an app. It's a basic app. But basically, if you don't have it, you can go to etcontactnetwork.com and download it. It'll put it on your smartphone, Android or iPhone. And you will register, and then you will come up, and you'll see who else is in your area. People have been asking for this for 10 years. How do I get hold of someone who wants to do the close encounters of the fifth kind contact protocols in Iowa? And we don't have any, by the way, we have no office or personnel. Like I said, my wife and I and some volunteers are doing all this. We don't have an office. We don't have a secretary. We don't have anything. Everything's done. So there's this wonderful volunteer who did this app for us. I met him at a retreat training to make contact up in Arizona 6 months ago. He says, oh, I'll do this for you. So he just volunteered his time to do it. He's a very busy tech guy. And so we've launched that. There are going to be more features coming. But the nice thing about spreading the word for that is that anyone who wants to be involved in the CE5 contact work in a local area, or if you travel, you can move the map and zoom into that. Say you're going to LA. And you can say, oh, I'm in the area, you guys, anybody there going to do anything? Or if you want to support just education, you may want to just get together with people and host a screening of, an educational screening of Sirius in your community. Or you may want to do something to get together with people who want to work on general disclosure issues and educate your community. Or you may want to find some people who are interested in these technology and free energy aspects of this that you can network with in your local community. You can use it for all those purposes. It isn't just for the CE5 initiative. But that's what it was initially conceived as, because we had so many team members from all over the world. And what was awesome was that the night we launched it at like 1 in the morning. I hit the button. And within hours, every single continent was lit up with little CSETI logo triangles. It was so much fun to watch. And, and now it's literally every continent, almost every country where there are people. So it's very, very exciting. So that's a great way for people to plug in to each other. And There is some confusion about that app versus what's called the ET Contact Tool, which is on SeriousDisclosure.com. That is actually a whole training program that goes through the protocols of remote viewing, meditation, the techniques of the CE5 initiative. It actually will take your smartphone and turn it into a magnetometer that will pick up magnetic field changes if a craft is near you, even if it's not visible. It may be transdimensional and translucent, but it'll set that off. All kinds of cool features, and that is something that is separate. That's more of a training and educational tool. This networking app, the etcontactnetwork.com, is purely so people can contact each other. That's all it does. Eventually, we may be able to get it so where people can actually have chat or IMing in it, and there are all kinds of features that it doesn't have that many people want it to have. And I said, well, this was one man with his volunteer efforts while he's running his own business doing this. So, I mean, this is, again, yeah, please understand that everything we do, from the Disclosure Project National Press Club event, all the books, the film Sirius, except for the production company, everyone involved with that were volunteers, work for free. So we don't have any paid staff, and we don't have, so when we get something like this, it's because someone said, I'll do it for you, which is great. The man he wants to remain anonymous, but he's just an amazing person. So.
Why was your strategy to choose to offer Earth people money? Because it seems like at any point they could get slapped with a national security order. I mean, seriously, could you try to contact the advanced civilizations for that technology?
Yeah, everyone thinks the ETs are going to land and give us one of these devices. Number one, that technology would be so many thousands of years advanced from where we are, no one would figure it out. You'd have to do a multi-billion-dollar reverse engineering study. Number two, that's not why they're here. In other words, everyone always asks, and I get this asked by people in politics, well, if they're here, why don't they just land on the White House lawn and force the issue? I said, because they're wiser than that. They know that unless we as a people learn through the steps of first stop lying to each other, bring out the truth, do this ourselves, there's no learning curve. So if it was imposed externally, that would be about as efficacious as us trying to impose Jeffersonian democracy on the warlords of Afghanistan. So that is not a solution, and they are too wise to know that. Thirdly, if there was something that was as overt as that, begging the question whether you could make Haydn or tell us what it is, and we bypass this process of coming together to do it, I think we're going to lose a big lesson of what it means to come together as human community to do something. And I don't think that's trivial. I mean, I think that it's like if you had a child and every time it stumbled, you caught it so it never learned to walk. And you infantilized it to the point of it never standing on its own. These civilizations, I personally believe, and there's a lot of ancient evidence for this, have been around thousands, millions of years. And I think that they're watching us evolve in fits and starts into something resembling a world civilization.